Welcome to the first of Solano Pride's 5-day series focusing on Transgender Day of Remembrance.
1 minute. Hold on. It's still doing its streaming setup. Sorry. Go.
Good evening and welcome to the first of Solano Pride's 5-day series focusing on Transgender Day of Remembrance. Tonight's programming is sponsored by one of our partners, the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive. My name is Jamie Booth. My pronouns are them and they, and he and him. I'm the Solano Pride Center's Youth Services Coordinator, and it's my pleasure to host this evening's event. During the presentation, we encourage those of you that are live streaming to please feel free to comment and or to ask questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the feed throughout and want to ensure your comments and questions are addressed. For me, this year's Transgender Day of Remembrance is especially notable for many reasons. Maybe the most forefront right now is that we're holding a virtual event this year, whereas normally this is a time we try to gather as a community in solidarity and love and commitment to change. For over 20 years, and each November, Solano Pride Center joins other LGBTQ centers in honoring and remembering transgender people who've lost their lives and that were taken by anti-transgender violence and hate crimes. This year, there was more anti-transgender violence than any ever recorded. Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is inspired by the 1998 murder of Rita Hester, raises public awareness of hate crimes against transgender people. It reminds non-transgender people that we're their children, parents, friends, neighbors, colleagues, students, lovers, peers, and it gives our allies a chance to step forward with us and stand in vigil, memorializing those of us who have died by hate crimes. To begin this week's programming, it's my humble honor to introduce Gwendolyn Ann Smith, the founder of the internationally observed Transgender Day of Remembrance. She has been an advocate for the transgender community for most of her adult life. As early as 1992, she lobbied America Online, aka AOL, persuading the company to change its policies and allow discussions on gender issues on their service. This led to the creation of Transgender Community Forum, the first public forum on a major online service to deal openly with transgender issues. It's because of her work that Solano Pride Center and so many other LGBTQ centers in our country are now able to offer services and programming to the transgender community. An avid writer, her bi-weekly column, Transmissions, has been running in the Bay Area Reporter, a San Francisco LGBTQ weekly, for the past 20 years. Her biography, Transactive, a biography of Gwendolyn Ann Smith by Sophia Cecilia Lequot, was released in 2017. Gwen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You've pretty much told everything I'm going to talk about, so I can just, no, I'm kidding. I'll be going into a lot of detail on these. As an introduction, just to further on that, yes, my name is Gwendolyn Ann Smith. I prefer she, her pronouns. I'll be speaking on some of my own journey, some of my own history as a trans person. And of course, obviously discussing some of the advocacy I've done over the last couple of decades. As was mentioned, I've written the Transmissions column for the Bay Area Reporter, as well as a couple of other papers that also appears outside of the area for about 20 years. And before that, I helped get Transgender Day of Remembrance started. And before that, yes, the Transgender Community Forum on America Online, which goes back quite a ways at this point. I also want to clarify anything that I'm discussing about like my history as a trans person is really only illustrative of my experience. You know, even if we don't share the same story, the same background or history, everyone is valid, no matter where you fall in trans or non-binary or gender questioning. You're welcome, you belong. Don't think that just because I have an experience that it needs to be the same as yours. And I want to go back kind of, I guess, to the beginning, really. I was born in the summer of love, July of 67. The attending physicians, Dr. Schoaf and Dr. Martin, they proclaimed I was a boy. They were wrong. And it was not the first time that, there'd be someone guessing wrong, I suppose. The first I knew that I wasn't quite like other girls that I knew was actually around age 3. I could not understand why I couldn't have the same shoes as other girls, and complained to my mom about this. Throughout childhood, we often argued about things like hair length and so forth. At my birthdays, I used to sneak, or Christmas as well, I used to sneak things onto my wish list. I thought I was being sneaky. I'd usually put them like 3 or 4 down on the list, just to, sneak it in there. Like, I want a Barbie doll back here under these things. It never quite worked, unfortunately. Then there was one night when I was about 10 years old. My parents and I were coming home in the evening from a road trip out in their 63 Dodge Dart. And on the radio was a relatively early radio therapist call-in program. And this particular call came on where a mother was trying to figure out advice. Their child had just come out to them as transsexual, was going to become a woman. The language was all very of its time. And for me, it was quite a bit of a shock hearing all of this, because I already figured out that there was something not quite right going on between how I felt internally and how the world was approaching me. By that point, I was already, every night praying that, I'd wake up the next morning as a girl and things like this. So I'm listening to the show host try to discuss transgender issues as best as she could in long distant past at this point. And I was really amazed hearing this information kind of for the first time, that there were these other people that felt similar to me. And then at the same time I was listening to this, my parents were commenting on the program at the same time. And they're up in the front seat, I'm shoved in the back. And I still remember, my parents talking, and my mom saying something like, how hard it must be to be that parent, to have to go through that with your child. And so it's really a moment for me that I heard this what was really rare and wonderful information to me, that this was something that was actually possible. And then at the same time, also finding out that, well, you probably shouldn't come out to your parents about it, because this is how they're going to react. It was like I got a little taste of it. So I decided maybe then was not the right time to discuss how that felt, listening to that program. In my younger days, this was pre-internet by a long shot. The only sources of information that you could really find, the library didn't really have much in it. I did find a small stash of like porno mags that my dad had in an outbuilding. And anything that was in it that was trans related, by and large, was fairly salacious. Probably the best thing out of any of them was the 1975 interview with Wendy Carlos in Playboy magazine, but most of it was not nearly that wonderful. But it was pretty much the only thing that I could find, the only thing that was out there. It wasn't like there was an internet to look at. There wasn't trans people on television, aside from, the occasional appearance on something like The Jeffersons or All in the Family. It just didn't come up. I eventually started to scour libraries looking for information. The hometown one that was a mile away from home, they really had nothing. The only book that was in the card catalog was Jan Morris's autobiography. Jan Morris, a trans woman from the 70s who'd been part of a party to reach the top of Mount Everest, and has had a long and storied career in Britain. And that book was missing from the shelves. So all I knew that there was a book out there, but I couldn't actually get it. My college library, they didn't have a lot. Eventually I managed to get to one of the larger city libraries in my area. Found 2 books, which were fairly informative to an extent. They're on the shelf behind me. Well, not the actual ones, I picked up later copies. I had to try to find information in like sexy singles rags that were on the newsstands, that I could find ads there for like trans related stores and so forth. And finally was able to find like my first support group to go to. Yet even support groups at the time, it was like they're a lot older than me. They were very closeted groups. It really didn't, I'm not judging them. That's perfectly fine. It's just that it really didn't feel like what I needed at the time. Now at that time, I was working for a large reprographics company chain, and was always looking for new materials to work with, fonts or clip art or whatnot. And I came across a book, Mac Shareware 500, I think it was, in early 1993. And it came with some compact discs in the back, or not compact discs, floppy disks. What people might today call the save icon, because nobody uses floppy disks anymore. And one of those disks, this disc, was one of these sign on to America Online for 5 free hours, which anyone who was around during that time knows that these discs were positively everywhere. So I stuck it in the computer and created an account and started digging around, finding out what I could on their service. There was 5 free hours, so I burnt through those pretty quickly and canceled the account and figured I would never go back. And then I said, maybe I'll give it another try, and open it back up. And well, I ended up sticking with that for several years. They had a section of America Online which was called the People Connection. And in that area, you could start your own little informal chat rooms on a particular topic you wanted. And one of those early days after I'd reopened my account, I saw a chat room that was called TV Chat. TV at the time was a fairly common acronym for transvestite, which was still a term that was in use, although today it's woefully outdated and a little quaint. And yeah, when I went into TV Chat, I quickly discovered that the discussion was, of course, as I had hoped, not about like the latest X-Files episodes. And yeah, the term transgender at the time was still a really new term. It really hadn't been used a lot. It was still considered something other than the sort of umbrella term it is today. It was being applied to individuals who lived full-time but weren't seeking surgery, as opposed to transvestites or transsexuals. Most times it was TV/TS that was used in the community. Even then, crossdresser was outmoding transvestite, and most of those terms we don't even use today, thankfully. But that was what was the parlance at the time. So I started to hang out in TV Chat, and discovered that it was really one of the only places on this huge online service where you could discuss trans issues. And even then, it was regularly getting shut down by the service. They didn't allow the discussion of transgender issues on America Online at the time. Now, as I mentioned, this is really before the World Wide Web really happened. It was still being used somewhat experimentally at the time. There were a couple of other places out there that you could find trans issues, such as BBS or a closed section on CompuServe that had a single discussion area on the issue. But it was still not something that you could really explore out in public. Now, one of the things that America Online did have that was somewhat useful is that you could have up to 5 usernames on your account. Their idea was that that way you could have an account for mom and dad and the kids and this sort of thing. It did, however, allow trans people in those days to create an account that was in a name other than the one that was on their ID in their wallet. For myself, that was the first time I got to be known regularly by the name I carry today. But we still had that wrinkle with AOL. Their terms of service clearly stated, see if I can quote this, discussions involving transvestism and transsexuality are forbidden. The company was fairly conservative. They really wanted to focus on kind of a family-oriented service, and they felt that that was simply not going to be acceptable. I mean, this is a company that one of its earliest big PR fiascos was that they put a word blocking filter in so that there were words that you simply could not type onto the service. And one of the terms that they blocked was breast. Unfortunately, they also chose to block that word during breast cancer awareness. And this obviously caused quite an issue for them, deservedly so. So we hid out in this room, and sure enough, eventually they got wise to TV chatting and what it was about, and they would close the group and threaten our accounts, and we would do this overnights. So we decided that, you know, the discussions we were having for the most part were completely innocuous. We were trans, and sometimes trans specific issues would come up. But for the most part, we were discussing how our day went, how we were doing in the world, just sharing information with each other. And yet we were considered to be in violation of their terms of service and not supposed to be doing anything like that on their service. So we ended up getting together, creating a group called the America Online Gender Group, where we started to plan how we were going to react to this. Some of our members were near enough to the offices. They went down to the offices to complain. A lot of us complained online using their own feedback systems to say, this needs to change. We started to discuss the issue with some of the local media to them to get that word out. And eventually, we managed to get that to change. At the time, one of the allies that we had in that fight was a different America Online area, which was the Gay and Lesbian Community Forum. They stepped up for us. They tried to help us out and make sure that our voices were heard internally. And because of that, we decided to work with them and see if we could get a dedicated space that wasn't just out in the regular connection rooms to discuss trans issues that was a permanent part of the system. They allowed us after some time, after a bit of a further discussions about what it's going to be and how that's going to play into what they wanted. We were able to form a place called the Transgender Community Forum on America Online, which was, at the time, it was the only public transgender discussion area on the internet that anyone could pop an AOL disk into their computer, join the system, and talk with trans people from around the world. One of the things about it, as well as providing a place to talk, message boards and live chat rooms, we also had a section of resources so that people could find information about being trans and how to do things, as far as, working on your voice or working on appearance, that were things that just were very hard to come by in that time. As I mentioned, trying to find that in my local library was simply not going to happen. Our chat room was the gazebo, which was named after one of the other individuals that found it who had passed away, who had likened being in the chat to being in like a gazebo space where you could get together and talk. We used what's now a fairly well-known symbol. It really wasn't at the time. A combination Venus and Mars symbol with another arm that had both symbols that was created by Holly Boswell. That's kind of the trans trine, the symbol now from an emoji. We started to create sub areas within that for different trans groups to try to bring them in so that they can provide their own resources. Most of those organizations, unfortunately, are no longer around, but like Transsexual Menace, Aegis, ICLEP, so forth. You had keywords to get to it. We managed to finally, even 2 years after America Online wouldn't allow any discussions on trans issues, we got them to allow transgender as an actual keyword on their service, which again meant that anyone could get there from the main page of America Online. Meanwhile, as that was going on, that was when I was starting to really explore and understand myself as a trans person, got into gender therapy, started hormones, eventually went through surgery. All the while this was going on with this forum. It was really kind of one of the first places that I could find people that had the same feelings with me, that were going through things similar to me. It was kind of a break from the previous generation into this connected generation, even it being America Online, which is at this point ages old. But it was really kind of the first place that I felt like I wasn't alone, that there was a bigger community of transgender people out there, which was extremely liberating and extremely freeing, given, otherwise living in a fairly conservative area that I couldn't, I was losing friends at times because I was coming out and my family was having difficulties, but I still had people who were like me who I could talk to. And I found that to be very, very important. And then there was a night at hanging out in the gazebo chat room in November of 1998. I had been talking with a number of people who were in the chat at that day about a murder that had happened in the local community in Boston just a day or two before. And that was the murder of Rita Hester. And I was talking with people, and one of the things I started to discuss about it was how similar that death was to a lot of other cases in that area, specifically the murder of Chanel Pickett, who was a transgender woman who was murdered on November 20th of 1995. I commented that, well, they were both in the Massachusetts area. They're both African-American trans women. They both had, gone to a club that night before they'd been killed. So it was probably someone who had picked them up. I started to really look, even, it was late November, both these cases. And that's not to say that either of those cases actually were connected, nor did I really think they were connected at that time, because Chanel Pickett's murder was already at that point behind bars. But it was still an interesting coincidence, I felt. And I was discussing this, and the individuals who were in the chat room, including others who were in the Boston area, replied, well, who's Chanel Pickett? What do you mean? I don't know anything about this. And it really caught me off guard, because this was a case that had gotten media coverage in the Boston area. It was a trans woman who There was a fairly well-publicized trial when William Palmer, who killed her, got manslaughter as opposed to murder. So it really surprised me that there was no memory of this. There was no knowledge that was being preserved. This led to me starting the Remembering Our Dead project. I was frustrated to hear that, you know, we were forgetting this important history. We were forgetting someone who was murdered, and we were seeing another murder in the same area that was very similar when we shouldn't. You know, it's the George Santayana quote about those who forget their past are doomed to repeat it. And here we were forgetting and we were repeating. So I decided the next night to start what was the Remembering Our Dead project. And I started to find any resources that I could of anti-transgender murders that had happened prior to that date. In its first form, there were 30 cases on the site because that was really all I could find. Now, of course, it's got thousands of names that have been chronicled on anti-trans murder. A few months after the site launched, there was a fledgling trans advocacy group in San Francisco called TG Rage, and there were a lot of people who were trying to get change there. They were trying to work on some stalled initiatives in San Francisco and get things going. And what we decided to do within the group was to do a public demonstration. The Castro Theater was showing the Brandon Tina story, which was a documentary on Brandon Tina. It predates Boys Don't Cry by a couple of years. It's an entirely factual retelling of the story. Boys Don't Cry took a few liberties. This was much more specific to the case. And we decided that, you know, let's go out in front of the theater. Let's hold up signs that have all these cases that are on the site and draw attention to the fact that these murders are happening, that it's not just this single story that you're seeing in the theater. There's dozens, hundreds of stories out there. So in February of 1999, a number of us took signs with all the names that we had at the time. By that time, it was about under 100 names that we knew. We stood out in front of the theater in the rain, holding up these signs. And we realized as a group that maybe there was something there. Maybe this was something that we should look at repeating. In discussions after that, I was talking with a friend of mine, Penny Ash Matz, in Boston. And of course, they're still dealing with the Rita Hester murder. And she felt, you know, maybe we should, you know, do something here as well. So between the two of us, we held the first TDOR, November of 1999, primarily to focus on Rita Hester and all these other cases. And we called it Day of Remembrance. And that's where it started. The next year we had it and a few other places joined. The next year we had it and even more places were involved. Today it's an international event that's hosted at practically countless places around the world, from, you know, LA, New York, etc., to individuals in Moscow that are holding it in secret, so that they can actually do this event. In the Ukraine, where they face violence trying to hold this event, you know, to all around the world, which for myself is extremely humbling. It was something that I started with the notion that, again, we were forgetting this history and I wasn't sure that anyone was going to remember it. And seeing where it is today, where it is everywhere, is it kind of takes my breath away. It really does. And like I said, I'm very humbled with what it's become. My work on anti-trans violence through the project is taking me several directions. As I mentioned before, I began to write for the Bay Area Reporter about a year or so after TDOR started. Initially, they had me on to do an op-ed about anti-trans violence and how much attention the Matthew Shepard case was getting versus the Rita Hester case. And that ended up turning into doing a regular every other week column for the paper, which has run now for 20 years this month. I have taken that to other newspapers. I've ended up being picked up by other outlets like LGBTQ Nation to write other pieces, which was definitely not something I ever expected to do. It also led me to be a court observer for the trial into the murder of Gwen Araujo. She was a transgender teen who was murdered in Newark, California in 2002. It was her death actually that led to California barring so-called trans panic defenses, where a perpetrator can claim the shock of discovering that someone they had been intimate with was transgender, and that would be a valid defense for murdering that person as a crime of passion, which was in fact used in the Araujo case. And while one of the individuals involved with the case is still in prison, the other three have since gotten out, in large part due to that sort of defense work. And I mentioned that the Transgender Day of Remembrance is honored worldwide, but it still remains an issue that transgender people are being killed at such a rate, and that rate has actually increased in the last couple of years. In 2020, we've seen 34 people who've been murdered due to anti-transgender violence in the United States that we know of. There's also 350 cases worldwide that we know of. That's practically a person every day. You know, in this country, it's a person every couple of weeks. It's just staggering when you think of those numbers. Today, the FBI released their 2019 hate crime statistics and shows a 2.7% increase in hate crimes overall of all forms of hate crimes. That said, that same report noted that there was a 21% increase in anti-transgender hate crimes over the year. Obviously, next year we'll get the numbers for 2020. This is a growing issue. Even with this project being so many years old, we are still seeing these cases. And in the last 3 years, we've seen these cases grow at alarming numbers. And for me, that tells me that the work isn't complete yet, that there's still things that need to be done. And it's why we still, even in these times of COVID, where we're having to do virtual events rather than in-person events, it's still important that we come together to honor the people we lost and continue to fight for all of us who are still here, and make sure that these deaths aren't forgotten. And that's really why I'm here today. I'm glad to be here and be a part of it. I don't know if we want to go ahead and take some questions or anything like that. Discuss things.
And Gwen, throughout your entire conversation, you just had me all the way back to my childhood and thinking about similar situations in life and how that kind of evolves with technology and support from outside community. And, you know, you really were the spur of something that I think so many trans people, and especially trans youth, they cling to social media and social groups and virtual communities where they can find community because it isn't so prevalent and because there are so many stigmas. Do you ever look back on it and think that because of your initial work, that where we're at now, supporting the LGBT cause?
I feel I pardon me while I stutter a little bit. I feel like there's a lot of truth to that. At the same time, I don't want to have a big head about it. I don't want to really think like that. I want to think that, you know, if it wouldn't have been me, it may have been someone else. That this was something that had to happen. And I think that we did it at that time, but it became much bigger when the web started to come up and then social media started to come up. We transgender people end up facing so much stigma in our communities that we have to find each other. We have to make that possibility. You know, with everything that I could find growing up and, you know, eventually discovering small pockets of trans community hiding in the back of the Holiday Inns at the time, or in the very, very occasional trans clubs you might find. You know, that was not enough. That was only so much support, and being able to find, you know, the notion of today where finding trans information, finding trans support, finding like minds is so much easier. And I mean, social media is very powerful on that, you know, and it is an outgrowth of what we were doing at that time. I think that there's a lot to say for, you know, what we were doing then and bringing the trans community together and bringing organizations in to assist, helped shape a lot at that time, but it's just continued and it's bloomed and it's gotten even bigger than anything we could have imagined in 1995.
Yeah, you're right about that. And these next 4 years will be a telling 4 years, will they not?
Yeah.
We have some questions from our viewers. What can people do to make sure we give support to transgender folks, but not make them feel odd or awkward?
That's a good question. I'd say one of the first things to do is listen to them, take them seriously. Don't impose upon them. You know, try to say, well, maybe this is you, maybe that's you, maybe this is your path, but let them find their path and support them through that process, no matter what it might be. No matter, you know, they might decide it's not the right thing for them. They might decide that, you know, they feel one way one day, whether they feel like they fall in a non-binary path versus a more trans-binary path. And they might switch from that. They might feel differently as they learn and grow. I know that when I first was starting to come out, I wasn't sure where I was going to fall, you know, whether, you know, I was planning to have surgery and hormones and all of this, or if I was just going to live my life. I didn't know at the time. And so really, I think it's being there, listening and validating are really kind of key things, especially listening. Never assume that you know exactly what someone's going through or where they're going to end up, because you don't.
Right. Speaking of validating, that leads to the next question. How important has it been that we are now making sure that pronouns are known?
I think it's important. I think that the more that process is normalized, the more that the onus of pronouns is put on non-transgender people to include those in bios, to kind of normalize the process of discussing them at the beginning of presentations and so forth. I think that's important, and it moves things forward, really not only for trans people, for everyone, to break away from those assumptions. At the same time, when it's being pressed primarily on transgender people to be at the forefront of discussing their pronouns, we're not always sure what our pronouns are, or we might not necessarily be out about our pronouns. And it can put us into a really tough spot when that's forced upon us, where we're the ones that have to push that conversation or are expected to, be on the point. It's like, that's hard for us because there's so much going on, especially when we're starting out.
Yeah. This one's from a youth perspective. Oftentimes, transgender people and transgender youth specifically are put in positions of educating other people, educators, parents, loved ones, family, on transgender issues. What advice or suggestions could you offer them when having those types of conversations?
Oh God, yes. I mean, when this question came up, the first thought that came to my mind when I came out to my parents, which was a rocky coming out, they eventually decided it was a good idea to go to a family counselor to discuss this and find out how they can cope with this issue. And the counselor themselves had no knowledge whatsoever on transgender issues. He had a outdated copy of the DSM on the shelf that had very poor advice on trans issues, and that was all he had. And so you're entering this supposedly therapeutical environment, and I'm having to bring photocopies of information that's current for him to even begin to understand what I'm doing. And it's like, no, this is not at all helping this situation, because it wasn't helping my parents to understand. It wasn't even helping the therapist to understand where I was coming from. It's extremely difficult to go through that. One thing I recommend is trying to, rather than, it always being on your back, is to find a resource and tell people, go read this, go look at this, and come back. Go absorb that, rather than, me sitting here telling you about it. Because that's a lot of labor, that we shouldn't always have to have on our backs. I'd recommend, tell people to get a copy, the copy of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, which is a great, huge tome that has all of this deep, deep information. Go read that, then come back to me. There's, things like Disclosure, documentary on Netflix that, while it's very focused on media representation, there are some incredible gems in there of information about what trans people are and what we're going through. Educate yourself, go find information like that. We can point people to things, and I think that's fine, but it really shouldn't be on us to have to constantly do the education. We don't, we're going through stuff. We don't have to be your 101, when we're still trying to figure out ourselves.
I think you've just rang about 1,000 bells out there, including my own. The next thing we have a question, but also a statement from one of our partners at the Serenity Center, who will actually be presenting tomorrow evening.
Awesome.
I remember attending my first TDOR. It moved me to push to start Solano Serenity Center. The utter disbelief in all those names and the ones I read took my breath away. And Serenity also said, I thank you for doing this, and now we all are opening eyes everywhere. A question, what do you say to older generations that stumble and just don't get how important it is to be aware of pronouns and trans issues and the trans violence that we are still encountering even 21 years after you began this work?
That's a hard question, because it's hard to open a mind that's locked. There are people that simply don't want to learn, that simply have decided that this is an issue that they don't care about, that doesn't exist in their world. We live in this time where there's so many people out there that have ossified their brains on any number of issues, whether it's trans issues or even wearing a mask in a pandemic, that it's hard to break through. For myself, when I think of the times that I've been faced with that, it ultimately comes down to, if it's someone who's important to me in my life, if it's, you know, a family member or something like that, they really have a choice. And it's on them. It's not on me. They can change. They can try to understand me, or I shouldn't be in their life. And if they have any value in having a relationship with me, they really need to do some work.
That's a hard conversation to have with yourself, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to, for a lot of trans people, this is not an easy path to walk. And ultimately, the choice that some people can have is, you can have someone in your life that you love, or you can have someone that you lost, whether they walked out, whether something happened to them. Yeah. That's the two possibilities. Do you care about this person? Then you're going to have to work on it.
Well said. Again, you're ringing bells. Another question: where can someone find resources for parents, siblings, other relatives, and allies who are adjusting to someone who is transitioning?
One of the first would be PFLAG. Some of them might not necessarily be the best at it, but there's a lot of them out there that are really good at it and have some really nice resources on it. PFLAG is always a good place. Again, books I mentioned, you know, Trans Bodies, it's a good one for them too. You know, get books.
I tell everyone, especially the youth in my groups, that librarians have saved my life. And I took refuge in many a library in my time. Mm-hmm. Get books, definitely. I think I would also add, seek out your local organizations. There's no shortage of them in the Bay Area.
Right.
Sadly, when you come out of the Bay Area into more rural districts like Solano and even into—
it's a little more difficult.
Right. And attitudes are different, and people's biases are a little more screwed in or dialed in, like you were saying earlier. What could you say to other LGBT folks who want to get more involved and become a little more like you and raise their voices a little louder, especially when our policies are about to change?
There is no shortage of work out there that can be done. We do live in a very interesting time, and I'm gonna tell a little story. So I will get back here, but I'm gonna tell a little story. I probably should have told it earlier, but in the Obama years, one morning I went to my home computer and had an email from Mara Kiesling of the National Center, NCTE, transequality.org. And it said something about coming to Washington, D.C. And I figured, oh, what are you asking for money now? Because you get that sort of view that, you know, well, it's coming from one of the organizations they're asking for. And I opened up the email, and no, actually she was saying, how soon can you get on a plane and come into Washington, D.C.? Because she had a meeting set up, and an individual she was going to have, you know, she had a number of trans people who were coming. And as it was a meeting in November, November 18th. She thought it would be a good idea to have me there because it was around TDR. And as it turned out, this particular meeting was being held on the west wing of the White House in the Eisenhower building. And I actually am not able to discuss everyone that was there. I'm not going to say that the president or vice president at the time were there. They were not. I will confirm that much. But there were other people that were involved with the administration that were present, including potentially members of the vice president's office. And I was able to be on the west wing of the White House and discuss TDOR, and then hear these people talking to me about, well, you know, we're going to do this at the Department of Justice and we're going to do this Department of Education. Now, I will say that over the last 4 years, watching everything that had been discussed from every one of those departments go away. Every initiative we discussed that day, it's like I could have put up a big board on the wall and just X them all out. And that hurts, you know, that hurts. But knowing that in spite of what someone might be saying, Joe Biden has won, and he was the vice president, and he has said the words, and he has continually done the work for transgender people, gives me that hope that I'll be able to take the eraser to all of those and watch them all come back. And that's incredibly gratifying from both a personal standpoint of someone who had been there, and also from just being a trans person and knowing that my rights will be protected. Now, that said, there's a lot of work because there are a slate of bills throughout this country in different state houses that are going to potentially affect trans people, where they're trying to kick trans youth out of sports programs, or, you know, take away the ability of doctors to treat trans people under threat of being jailed or fined. There are some horrible, horrible bills out there. The ACLU is handling a lot of those. I'm not affiliated with them, but I support their work. That's all on the web, on their website, as far as what those bills are happening. Get out there, contact your legislators, send them friendly little notes all the time saying, hey, these are my rights. That's important. A lot of the more conservative voices aren't going to hear you, but we do have allies, and you can make allies. Contacting the media when things need to be discussed. You can do anonymous letters to the editor. You don't have to out yourself, but make your voice heard. And really, anytime that you are discussing yourself as a trans person, as non-binary, as whatever, to other people, you're affecting change. You know, even if it's just that one person, you are affecting that change.
Boy, now you are completely singing my song. I feel a little greedy. I could ask you questions and talk to you all night. We do have some more questions.
Okay.
This one's kind of closer to my heart as an LGBT youth advocate. One of the many things that were scratched that we're supporting or we're supposed to have supported our trans community was Title IX. And the guidance that the Obama administration had put forth, and then its retraction from the Trump administration, it left a lot of gray area in individual districts as to how they were going to support trans youth.
Mm-hmm.
And this in particular, you know, Solano Pride has a welcoming schools initiative, as do many other counties and many other places in California. We're trying to get into schools to kind of change that initial bias and reverse those issues. And we have a parent that says, is there any advice for parents of 10 and under, children that is expressing transitioning desires and tendencies? How can they be supported best? Do you want to end it at 6 p.m.? I don't know if we'll end it at 6 p.m.
We'll find out how that works.
Right.
And it is a big question, because, you know, for someone who's not, who's not trans, who's at a school, who has any number of other issues, you would go to the school counselors, and you would go to the teachers, and you would go to meetings with you know, your local PTA and address these issues. And when you add trans to the mix, all of a sudden it becomes a big issue. It's not, you know, my student, you know, my kid has a learning disability or a physical issue. It becomes this whole politically charged thing, and it really shouldn't be. The humanity gets lost. The fact that this is a child who has a distinct need, who needs to be supported, gets utterly lost in issues that, you know, the religious right or whoever want to push, to tell trans kids that they don't exist, or that they're not equal, or their bodies are wrong, or whatever. It's such a frustrating thing, and I don't know if there's a good answer beyond what, you know, finding your allies. There is information out there. Like I mentioned, PFLAG's information. There is other stuff out there. You know, there's Jazz Jennings' book. There's other books out there. Flamingo Rampant is a bookseller that focuses on books for trans and gender nonconforming youth. That is dynamite. And I'm not just saying that because Bear Bergman, who runs it, used to hang out with me back in the gazebo back in those days. You know, these are the things to, you know, get out there and find, and just support your child for whatever they want to explore. You know, for young kids, we really don't, you know, we don't do hormones or surgery or any of these big issues. But for God's sakes, if a boy wants to wear a dress, let him wear a dress. You know, if you know, if they decide that they're trans and that that's who they are, support them. Yeah. That's all it is, you know, support.
We often talk in group about how sometimes definitions can be really supportive and can help galvanize us, but then they can also separate us when we don't really subscribe to every part of a definition. Mm-hmm. When we talk about transgender people, that's a big, huge umbrella. Did you ever imagine as a trans kid growing up that there would be so many definitions to describe you?
No.
To describe?
You know, it's one of the things that's actually been cool. I've always been, once I discovered that there was a trans community, once that term started to be used, I've always been kind of a big tent. I've always wanted to see anyone who wants to be there is welcome here. But when I started out, there were only like 2 definitions. You were this, you were that, done. And to really see it grow and to see so many possibilities and so many options is so cool. I mean, it really is cool to see people be able to explore under, I mean, literally all these banners, you know, rather than, you know, you have to be this and this is what you are. The world is too rigid as it is anyway on definitions and binaries, and being able to have that freedom, whether trans or not, whether, you know, you're just being able to explore and decide for yourself, even if you're not trans, but, you know, you want to wear something that's not supposedly not, conforming to gender someday. Great. This is what we need in this world. We have such a strong binary push in so many places, and just, we don't need that. It's
Right?
cool to see.
It is very cool to see. I love the beginning of what this is, and what it will be in our future. Our young people who are our future are more than anything allies of one another when it comes to gender confirming. Another question from Serenity Center. How excited were you that Joe Biden recognized transgender people in his acceptance speech?
Damn excited. Also not surprised, but very excited. Even knowing that he's a supporter, he's, been a friend of Sarah McBride for a long time and wrote the introduction to her book. Back in the Obama years, he made the statement about transgender rights being the civil rights issue of our time. This is someone who obviously knows. Nevertheless, that could have been a time that he could have been very safe on his language and nobody would have batted an eye. Okay, I would have. But, there are people in the community that would have gone, you could have said that. But the fact that he did take that step was important and showed where we're going. So it's very exciting.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think that for me, I feel passionate about this as well. I think for me, it was, when the CDC were told to remove language that is specifically used to support transgender people, and then to see another side of that in the work, especially the work that Serenity Center does on HIV awareness and AIDS.
Mhm.
It's a matter of national, I don't know. I think people need to be aware that people are being indiscriminately killed, and a lot of people in schools that are trans and gender non-confirming are being bullied. And I for one am hoping that Biden will sooner rather than later not just heal our country, but start healing some of the fractures. What do you, in your magic wand and your list of top 5, what are your top 5 that you would like to see, initiated first?
Just 5?
Okay, top 5.
I mean, yeah. First and foremost, we need to address some of the things that were removed. We need to look at the trans-military ban and get rid of that. I may not be necessarily the biggest people on military, but why trans-military ban? That's something that a lot of trans people have gone into the military, that, it's a job, it's being part of our country, it's a way to finance yourself and continue in life, should you choose to. And that was just mean. It was really just a mean step to do. The CDC guidelines, the Housing and Human Services, and being able to have a place for homeless trans people to be in. That was a mean step too. The stuff around, students, as far as being able to participate in school life, not just in sports, but just school life in general, in your gender, is so important. So many of these steps really, to me, were about disenfranchising transgender people from society. If you can't get into a shelter when you need it, you're going to die out on the street. You can't use a restroom, well, then you're not going to go to school, because you got to be able to use a restroom. All of these things all end up tying into that. So yeah, the work of the DOE needs to be put back in place. Housing, homeless shelters, military ban. These are all things that need to be focused on. Really anything that one of the things that, I mean, I discussed it numerous times over the years. When you're dealing with the presidency, we talk about the Obama presidency or the Trump presidency or the Biden presidency, but it's all of these departments that are beneath the president, the vice president's office, Department of Education, Justice, HUDs, that all of these departments have people that are doing work continually. And you don't need just the president to put something out there that's bad when you've got hundreds of people out there that can do the bad work. So now it's the time to get the hundreds of people into the good work and change that.
I agree. One last question.
Sure.
And maybe this is the way we should end it anyway. I just got notified that California specifically is under COVID restriction yet again. And of course, there's that quarantining issue if you do travel. And holidays, being what holidays are for many, it's stressful as much as it's joyous, hopefully. But sometimes, especially for the LGBTQ community, they are just loaded with microaggressions from the family and loved ones. And what suggestions can you give a trans person, especially a young trans person, on how to survive a little longer until we can fix things and get them back on track?
Have a buddy. Have someone that you can have someone out there that you can get a hold of, whether it's texting, phone, social media, whatever, that you can talk to so that you can decompress from the microaggressions and can have a sympathetic ear. Because the holidays are a time when it all comes out because your family's there and they're going to call you whatever name they grew up with, and they're going to tell you that that's what they're going to continue to call you for whatever reason, or they're going to have issues with pronouns or just any number of things. I mean, you and I, we've heard of them all. Have someone that you can reach out to, that you can vent to, that you can have a sympathetic ear with, so that you know that this isn't forever. This is just the holidays, and there's a whole lot more time to go. I think that's probably the number one thing, is just have someone that you can reach out to, that you can share with, so that it's not just you're stuck with the family.
There, as you and I both know, there is a huge family out there just waiting with open arms, especially around the holidays. Well, I guess with that, our programming for this evening's come to an end. Gwen, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of our LGBT community for your continued advocacy and work. You are inspiring to not just myself, but a lot of people. But more than anything, thanks for being the best type of role model any young LGBT person could look up to. You're astounding. You are a trailblazer. Your work has undoubtedly saved thousands of lives already.
I hope so.
I know so. I know so. So I hope everyone watching will join the rest of this week's programming. And with that, I say good night.
All right. Take care. Thank you for having me.